The veteran rancher feared the canyon until 3 native girls crossed and called his name in the echo. The sound came at midday when the sun hung like a blazing eye above the red rock walls of Perdition Canyon. Marcus Thornfield froze in his saddle, his weathered hands tightening on the reins as his horse snorted and danced beneath him. For 23 years, he had avoided this place, had built his ranch deliberately on the far side of the mesa to keep the canyon out of sight and out of mind. But today, his prize bull had wandered through a break in the fence, following an old cattle trail that led straight into the heart of his nightmares. The echo rolled across the stone walls like thunder made of human voices, carrying a name he had not heard spoken aloud in decades. Marcus Thornfield. The sound bounced from cliff to cliff, growing stronger instead of weaker, as if the canyon itself were calling to him. His horse, a steady gelding named Buck, shifted nervously beneath him, ears twitching at sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marcus had ridden through Confederate gunfire without flinching, had faced down rustlers and wolves and the kind of winter storms that could kill a man in minutes. But this place, this godforsaken slash in the earth where the Colorado River had carved its way through millions of years of stone, filled him with a dread that made his hands shake. He was 58 years old, a veteran of battles that had left him with a metal plate in his skull and memories that visited him in the small hours of the night. His ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime grazing land in the high desert of Utah Territory, successful enough to employ 6 full-time hands and support a herd of nearly 200 head of cattle. By any measure, Marcus Thornfield was a man who had conquered his corner of the world, but he had never conquered Perdition Canyon. The name itself was his doing, coined during his first and only previous visit to this place 23 years ago, when he had been a different man with a different name and different dreams. He had been running then, fleeing from a past that had followed him across half the continent, and the canyon had seemed like the perfect place to disappear forever. Instead, it had become the place where everything he thought he knew about himself had died. Now the voices came again, clearer this time, definitely female and definitely calling his name. Marcus Thornfield, we see you. We have been waiting. Buck whinnied and tried to turn away from the canyon's edge, but Marcus held him steady, his eyes scanning the maze of red rock formations below. The canyon was perhaps 400 feet deep at this point, its walls painted in layers of sediment that told the story of ancient seas and vanished mountains. Far below, the river wound like a silver thread through cottonwood groves that provided the only green in a landscape of rust and gold. Movement caught his eye on the far side of the canyon, 3 figures making their way down what looked like an impossible path carved into the sheer rock face. Even at this distance, Marcus could see that they were young women, their long dark hair streaming behind them as they moved with the confidence of people who belonged to this vertical world in ways he never could. Native girls, by the look of them. Probably Ute, though Marcus had never learned to distinguish between the different tribes that called this region home. They wore traditional clothing mixed with modern elements, buckskin dresses decorated with beadwork that caught the sunlight like captured stars. As he watched, one of them raised her hand and waved, the gesture clearly directed at him. Marcus Thornfield, the voices called again, and this time Marcus was certain the sound was coming from the 3 climbers. But that was impossible. They were more than half a mile away, separated from him by the vast gulf of the canyon. No human voice could carry that distance, especially not with the clarity and volume that made it seem as if they were standing right beside him. Marcus urged Buck closer to the edge, close enough to see the details of the rock formations below, close enough to feel the updraft of warm air that rose from the canyon's depths. The scent that came with the air was complex and strange, carrying hints of water and growing things, of sage and cedar and something else he couldn't identify, something that reminded him of ceremonies he had witnessed but never understood, of smoke and sweetgrass, and the kind of silence that felt pregnant with meaning. The 3 women had reached a broad ledge perhaps halfway down the canyon wall, and Marcus could see them more clearly now. They were young, probably in their late teens or early 20s, and they moved with the fluid grace of people who had grown up in this landscape of stone and sky. The eldest appeared to be the leader, standing slightly ahead of the others, as she looked up toward Marcus's position on the rim. Come down, Marcus Thornfield, she called, and once again, Her voice carried with impossible clarity across the vast space between them. "We have something that belongs to you. Something that belonged to him." Marcus felt his chest tighten with a mixture of fear and curiosity that he hadn't experienced since his early days on the frontier. What could these strangers possibly have that was his? He had never met them, had never ventured into the canyon since that terrible day 2 decades ago when he had learned that some places in the world were too sacred, too dangerous, too heavy with meaning for outsiders to trespass without consequences. But his bull was down there somewhere, probably drinking from the river, and completely oblivious to the fact that his wandering had led his owner into a confrontation with his deepest fears. Thunder was worth more than most men made in a year. A prize Angus bull whose bloodline was sought after by ranchers throughout the territory. Marcus couldn't afford to lose him, couldn't afford to let fear override practical necessity. "Damn it," Marcus muttered under his breath, then louder. "Stay where you are. I'm coming down." He guided Buck along the rim until he found the narrow trail that local ranchers had used for generations to reach the canyon floor. It was not a path for the faint of heart, cutting back and forth across the rock face in a series of switchbacks that seemed designed to test a rider's courage and his horse's sure-footedness. But Marcus had ridden worse trails during the war, and Buck was as steady a mount as any man could ask for. The descent took nearly an hour, each step carefully measured as horse and rider made their way down through layers of geological time. The higher they climbed down, the older the rock became, until Marcus felt as if he were traveling backward through millions of years of Earth's history. The walls rose around them like the ramparts of some impossible cathedral, painted in shades of red and orange and gold that seemed to glow with their own inner light. As they descended, the air grew cooler and more humid, heavy with the scent of water and growing things. The sound of the river became audible, a constant murmur that seemed to carry voices and whispers just below the threshold of understanding. Marcus found himself listening intently, trying to separate real sounds from the echoes of memory that this place awakened in him. The 3 women were waiting for him at the bottom, standing beside a pool where the river had carved a natural amphitheater in the stone. They were even more striking up close, with the kind of classical beauty that reminded Marcus of ancient sculptures he had seen in books. But it was their eyes that held his attention, dark and intelligent, and filled with a knowledge that seemed far older than their apparent years. "Welcome back, Marcus Thornfield," said the eldest, stepping forward with a grace that made her seem to glide across the stone. "I am Luna Crowwing, daughter of Joseph Crowwing, keeper of the canyon stories. These are my sisters, Dawn and Star." Marcus dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt 45 at his hip before he caught himself and let his arm fall to his side. These women posed no physical threat, but there was something about their presence that made the air feel charged with electricity, as if a storm were building despite the clear sky overhead. "You know my name," Marcus said, his voice rusty from the long silence of the descent. "But I don't know you." "How is that possible?" Luna smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something radiant and warm. "We know many things about many people, Marcus Thornfield. The canyon remembers everyone who has ever walked its paths, who has ever drunk from its waters, who has ever sought refuge in its embrace." Dawn, who appeared to be the youngest of the 3, stepped forward with something clasped in her small hands. "You left this behind," she said, holding out an object that made Marcus's heart stop. It was a locket, silver and tarnished with age, engraved with the initials MT and ER. Marcus had thought it was lost forever, buried somewhere in the chaos of that terrible day 23 years ago when he had fled this place in terror and shame. Inside the locket was a photograph of Emma Ramirez, the woman he had loved and lost, the woman whose death had driven him to the edge of this canyon with thoughts of joining her in whatever lay beyond. "Where did you find this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You dropped it at the sacred spring," Star said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was musical, with the cadence of someone who had grown up speaking a language where tone and rhythm carried as much meaning as words. "When you ran from the vision that the spirits showed you." Marcus felt the years fall away like shed clothing, carrying him back to that day when he had been a different man with a different understanding of the world. He had come to the canyon seeking death, had climbed down to this very spot with a loaded pistol and a heart so heavy with grief that each breath felt like lifting stones. Emma had been dead for 6 months, killed by the same fever that had taken so many others during the epidemic that swept through Denver that winter. But at the sacred spring, something had happened that defied his understanding of reality. He had seen Emma, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living presence that spoke to him with her own voice and her own will. She had told him that his time had not come, that he had work to do in the world of the living, that love was not ended by death, but transformed into something larger and more enduring. The vision had terrified him, had challenged everything he believed about the nature of existence and the boundaries between life and death. He had run then, had scrambled up the canyon walls like a man pursued by demons, and had never returned until today. "You saw her," Luna said, not a question but a statement of fact. "You saw Emma Ramirez, and she told you to live." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The locket felt warm in his palm, as if it had been resting near a fire, rather than lying in the canyon for more than 2 decades. "The sacred spring is a place where the veil between worlds grows thin," Dawn explained, her young face serious and intent. "Our grandmothers have been its guardians for generations beyond counting, helping those who come seeking answers to understand what they have seen. But you ran before the lesson was complete," Star added gently. "You took Emma's message about living, but you did not learn what it meant to live well." Marcus looked at the 3 women, at their faces that reflected wisdom far beyond their years, and felt something shift in his chest. "What do you mean?" "You built a ranch," Luna said, settling gracefully onto a flat stone beside the pool. "You became successful, prosperous, respected in your community. But you also became isolated, alone, cut off from the connections that make life meaningful." Dawn sat beside her sister, her feet dangling in the clear water. "You have employees but no friends. You have wealth but no joy. You have survived but you have not truly lived." Marcus felt the words hit him like physical blows, each one finding its mark with uncomfortable accuracy. He had indeed built a successful ranch, had indeed achieved the kind of material prosperity that most men could only dream of. But he had also built walls around his heart, had kept everyone at arm's length, had chosen safety over connection at every opportunity. "Emma told you to live," Star said, joining her sisters beside the pool. "But living means more than just breathing and working and accumulating possessions. Living means opening your heart to others, allowing yourself to love and be loved, accepting that loss is part of the human experience, but not the end of it." Marcus felt tears threatening to spill from his eyes, emotions he had kept locked away for decades, suddenly demanding release. "I was afraid," he admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Afraid of losing someone else the way I lost her. Afraid of that kind of pain again. Fear is natural," Luna said with gentle understanding. "But fear is also a choice. You can choose to let it rule your life, or you can choose to honor Emma's memory by embracing the love she wanted you to find." The sound of lowing cattle interrupted the conversation, and Marcus looked up to see his prize bull emerge from a grove of cottonwoods downstream. Thunder looked perfectly content, his coat glossy and his movements relaxed as he browsed on the lush grass that grew beside the water. "He led you here," Dawn observed with a smile. "Animals know things that humans often forget. They understand that sometimes we need to be guided back to places we have avoided." Marcus studied his bull, considering the possibility that Thunder's escape had been less accident than destiny. The idea would have seemed ridiculous a few hours ago, but sitting beside this sacred pool with 3 women who knew impossibly much about his past, he found himself open to explanations that transcended the merely rational. "What would you have me do?" Marcus asked, the question emerging from a place of genuine uncertainty rather than skepticism. "Return to the world of the living," Star said simply. "Open your heart to the people around you. Allow yourself to form the connections that Emma wanted you to have." Luna reached into a leather pouch at her waist and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth. "This is for you as well," she said, handing him the bundle. "A gift from Emma, delivered through us." Marcus unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers, revealing a ring that took his breath away. It was Emma's wedding ring, the one she had been wearing when she died, the one he thought had been buried with her. The gold band was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "How is this possible?" Marcus whispered. "Love transcends the boundaries we imagine separate life from death," Dawn said. "Emma's love for you did not end when her body failed. It continued, waiting for the right moment to reach you again." Marcus slipped the ring onto his little finger, the only digit small enough to accommodate the delicate band. As the gold touched his skin, he felt a warmth spread through his entire body, a sensation of being embraced by invisible arms that filled him with peace and purpose. "She forgives you," Star said quietly, "for all the years of isolation, for all the opportunities for connection that you let pass by. She forgives you, and she wants you to forgive yourself." The tears came then, 23 years of accumulated grief and loneliness pouring out in great racking sobs that echoed off the canyon walls. Marcus wept for Emma, for the life they had planned together, for all the love he had held back out of fear, for all the connections he had avoided in the name of protecting himself from pain. The three women sat with him in respectful silence, their presence a comfort without being intrusive. They understood grief, understood the way it could twist love into fear, understood the courage required to choose vulnerability over safety. When the tears finally subsided, Marcus felt emptied and renewed at the same time, as if he had been carrying a weight he hadn't realized was there until it was gone. The canyon around him looked different now, less threatening and more welcoming, painted in colors that seemed richer and more vibrant than before. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse but steady. "Now you go home," Luna said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. "But you go home as a different man than the one who descended into this canyon. You go home ready to live the life that Emma wanted for you." Dawn stood as well, smoothing her buckskin dress as she prepared to leave. "The canyon will always be here when you need to remember this day. But your life is up there, in the world of people and relationships, and the kind of love that makes existence meaningful." Star joined her sisters, the three of them forming a circle around Marcus as he struggled to process everything that had happened. "Remember us," she said. "Remember what you have learned here, and remember that love is always worth the risk of loss." Marcus watched as the three women began their ascent up the impossible path they had descended earlier, moving with the confidence of people who belonged to this vertical world in ways he never could. They did not look back, did not offer further explanations or instructions. They had delivered their message and their gifts, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with them. He caught Thunder easily, the big bull showing no inclination to resist, as Marcus fashioned a lead rope from his lariat. The ascent out of the canyon was slow and careful, but Marcus found that his fear had transformed into something else, a deep respect for the power of this place, mixed with gratitude for the lessons it had taught him. As they climbed higher, the walls of the canyon began to speak to him in ways they never had before. He could see the layers of time in the stone, could understand how millions of years of patient erosion had carved this cathedral in the desert. He could feel the presence of all the people who had walked these paths before him, native peoples who had considered this place sacred long before the first white settlers arrived in the territory. When they finally reached the rim, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that matched the canyon walls below. Marcus paused to look back at the place that had once filled him with dread, seeing it now as a gift rather than a curse, a source of wisdom rather than terror. The ride back to the ranch gave Marcus time to think about what the three women had told him, about the difference between surviving and truly living. He thought about his employees, good men who had worked for him for years, but whom he had never allowed to become friends. He thought about the neighbors who had invited him to social gatherings that he had always declined. He thought about the woman in town, Sarah Mitchell, who had shown obvious interest in his company and whom he had deliberately avoided out of fear. As the ranch came into view, Marcus felt a strange mixture of familiarity and disconnection. The buildings looked the same. The corrals and pastures were unchanged, but his perspective had shifted in ways that made everything feel new. This was still his home, still his life's work, but it no longer had to be his prison. His foreman, Tom Bradley, met him at the barn with obvious relief. "Thank God you found Thunder," Tom said, taking the bull's lead rope. "When I saw that fence was down and the tracks leading toward the canyon, I figured we'd lost him for sure." Marcus studied Tom's weathered face, seeing for the first time the genuine concern in the older man's eyes. Tom had worked for him for 8 years, had proven himself reliable and competent in every way, but Marcus had never taken the time to really know him as a person. "Tom," Marcus said, surprising himself with the words, "would you like to join me for dinner tonight? I feel like we should talk." Tom's eyebrows rose in surprise, but his smile was warm and genuine. "I'd like that, Mr. Thornfield. I'd like that a lot." That evening, as Marcus and Tom shared a meal and conversation that went far beyond ranch business, Marcus began to understand what the 3 women had meant about the difference between surviving and living. For the first time in years, he felt connected to another human being, felt the simple pleasure of sharing stories and laughter with someone who understood his world. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to implement the lessons he had learned in Perdition Canyon. He started accepting invitations to community gatherings, began treating his employees as friends rather than just workers, and even found the courage to call on Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher who had been waiting patiently for him to overcome his fear of connection. Sarah was a widow herself, a woman in her 40s who understood loss and the way it could make a person afraid of loving again. Their courtship was gentle and careful, built on mutual respect and shared understanding rather than the passionate intensity of youth. But it was real and meaningful in ways that honored both Emma's memory and the possibility of new happiness. 6 months after his encounter in the canyon, Marcus stood at the altar of the small church in town, watching Sarah walk down the aisle in a simple blue dress that made her eyes sparkle like sapphires. In his pocket, he carried Emma's locket and her ring, not as burdens of the past, but as blessings that had led him to this moment. As the minister spoke the words that would bind him to Sarah in marriage, Marcus felt Emma's presence in the church, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as a warm approval that filled his heart with peace. She had wanted him to live, to love, to embrace the connections that made existence meaningful. In choosing to marry Sarah, he was honoring Emma's final gift to him. The reception was held in the town hall, a simple celebration that brought together ranchers and merchants, teachers and craftsmen, all the people who made up the community that Marcus had held at arm's length for so many years. As he danced with his new wife, surrounded by friends he was finally allowing himself to have, Marcus thought about the 3 women who had made this transformation possible. He never saw Luna, Dawn, and Star again, though he sometimes heard stories from other ranchers about mysterious native women who appeared to travelers in distress, offering guidance and wisdom to those who needed it most. Some claimed they were spirits, others insisted they were simply members of the local Ute band who had taken on the role of informal counselors for troubled souls. Marcus didn't much care about the explanation. What mattered was that they had given him back his life, had shown him the difference between existing and truly living. The canyon that had once been a source of fear had become a source of strength, a reminder that love was indeed worth the risk of loss. That connection was more valuable than safety, that the human heart was designed for relationship rather than isolation. Years later, when Marcus was an old man surrounded by children and grandchildren, he would sometimes ride out to the rim of Perdition Canyon and look down into its depths. The sacred spring was still there, still offering its gifts of wisdom and healing to those brave enough to seek them. And sometimes, if the light was right and the wind was still, he could swear he heard 3 voices calling across the vast space between the walls, reminding him to live well, to love deeply, and to never forget that death was not the end of love, but simply its transformation into something larger and more enduring. The veteran rancher had feared the canyon until 3 native girls crossed and called his name in the echo, but they had not called him to destruction. They had called him to redemption, to renewal, to the understanding that the greatest courage was not in facing death but in choosing life again and again, despite all the reasons to retreat into the safety of solitude. Marcus Thornfield died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, surrounded by the family he had finally allowed himself to have. His last words were a whispered thank you, directed not at the people gathered around his bedside, but at 3 women who had once stood on an impossible ledge in a sacred canyon and reminded him what it meant to be fully human. The echo of their voices had carried him home to himself, and in doing so, had carried him home to love.